Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining. I want to welcome you to a very special event that we're putting on today with the chance to interview the distinguished Harvard economist, Dr. Benjamin Friedman, about his new book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. My name is Dr. Mike Kane, and I direct the project for philosophy of finance for the Collegium Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, and am a lecturer in the Department of Economics there. The Philosophy of Finance project is one of several initiatives of Collegium to bring the influence of the humanities into the professions. And we specifically look at the ways in which philosophy and history influence the assumptions and the ideas behind the practice of finance and the field of economics more generally. So this new book of Dr. Friedman's is really right in the sweet spot of how we understand the influence of history on economic and financial ideas. I want to thank our co-sponsors for the event today. We have the Abigail Adams Institute as a co-sponsor, the Genealogies of Modernity Project, the Beatrice Institute, and the Program for Research in Religion and Urban Civil Society. So thank you for our co-sponsors for helping spread the word. Our distinguished guest today is Benjamin Friedman, who is the William Joseph Maier Professor of Political Economy and a former chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard, where he has been on the faculty for, I believe, 50 years now. We're also joined by my student, Kane Stanger, who is a rising senior at Penn studying economics. I believe it's quantitative economics, Caden?
I believe so, yes. So majoring in economics, and I'll be pursuing an honors thesis in Appalachian economics through my home of West Virginia.
Excellent. Well, welcome, and thank you for joining. So I want to start maybe on a lighter note. One of my favorite book reviews is by Groucho Marx, and his friend S.J. Perelman published a book of humor in the 1940s, and Groucho's review was, from the moment I picked it up, I was consumed with laughter. Someday I intend to read it. Well, I have picked up this book. Here it is, Dr. Friedman's book. I was not consumed with laughter. I think Perelman is funnier, to be honest, but I was consumed with a sense of how impressive the range of your scholarship is. And as I was reading the book, I was thinking there are very few economists who have immersed themselves in the theological debates of the 16th and 17th century, or who are conversant with the leading American Protestant preachers of the 19th century. And so as I was reading the book, which is beautifully written and well argued, I had the question of what inspired you to write the book in the first place, Dr. Friedman?
Well, Mike, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here with you and looking forward to engaging with you, and Caden with you as well. Looking forward to talking with both of you over the course of the next hour to hour and a half. And I think you're right about the fact that most economists today would not be familiar with much of the history that I'm writing about in the book. One of the points that I take for granted, because it's true, is that economics emerged in the first instance out of moral philosophy. Adam Smith was never an economist. The word didn't even exist when he lived. He was a professor of moral philosophy. And then as we move on through the 19th century, for a long time, economics and politics were taught and written about and researched together. The 19th century word for our subject was political economy. My title at Harvard is that I'm a professor of political economy. Doesn't mean I'm in the political science department. I'm not. It's just that political economy was the 19th century phrase for what became economics, and the word economics didn't really enter the discussion until 1890 with the publication of Alfred Marshall's book. Now, you asked what led me to do this line of research. The answer is, to repeat, I'm an economist, but I've always been interested in the origins of ideas. Why do ideas occur when they do, where they do? Why do they have the force that they acquire? And surely the central propositions of modern Western economics have acquired enormous force over the last 250 years. And the question that I looked at in the book is where our thinking. I understand that there are different kinds of economics in the world and have been, but I'm interested in our economics, what we teach in the classroom now, modern Western economics. Where did that come from? And in part, we all know that it's from Adam Smith, but that's only in part correct. And part of what we think we know turns out to be wrong. So I approached it as an economist interested in the intellectual origins of my discipline.
Okay, so let's follow that up. What is it that's being taught that you would say is wrong?
We all know that Adam Smith and David Hume and the other great figures who gave us modern Western economics, or at least the beginnings of it, were part of the Scottish Enlightenment. Well, that's true. But because we also typically think of the Enlightenment as a movement of thinking away from a God-centered universe toward what in our modern vocabulary we would call secular humanism, the usual presumption, therefore, is that modern Western economics didn't have much to do with religious thinking. And indeed, if you look at something like, say, Nick Phillipson's prize-winning biography of Smith, which I recommend to your students as I think the best biography of Smith for people who are interested in the work, not the best on the life, but the best on the work. Phillipson says in the book that he considers not just the Wealth of Nations, but Smith's entire project of developing a science of man, the way he and Hume would have put it, as a part of the way Phillipson phrased it, the quintessential assault on religion that stood at the heart of the Enlightenment. And I don't think Nick believed he was saying anything unusual or controversial when he wrote that in his biography. He just thought he was summarizing the standard view. Well, I think that view was standard and probably still is standard, but I think it's wrong. I think Smith and Hume, even though they were not religious believers, particularly, especially Hume, I think they were, their thinking was powerfully enabled by what were at that time new and controversial and highly contended lines of religious thinking within the English-speaking Protestant world in which they lived. And therefore, I think religious thinking was important right at the creation of modern Western economics. And as I try to show in the latter half of my book, as we come down through the 19th and the 20th centuries, even though the economy changed dramatically, and of course the questions that economists were asking changed along with it, I think this right from the bottom up influence of the religious thinking on the economic thinking persisted. And it was right there all through those 200 odd years. And I think we still see it today, especially in the United States and especially in our public conversation and our debate over economic policy and in the voting behavior of many ordinary Americans.
Would you say that you accepted the standard view that economics began as a rejection, as a secular enterprise, let's say, and later on came to question it? Or what triggered you to go and research the question in the first place?
Well, I didn't set out specifically to look at the religious origins of economic thinking. I set out to understand better where our economic thinking came from. And some strands of the usual view are, I think, correct, and I didn't need to spend a lot of time on them. So I mention them in my book, but I pass over them very quickly. So for example, the fact that Smith and his entire generation were trained in Newtonian thinking. Newton's great book, the Principia Mathematica, was published in 1687. By the time Smith was an undergraduate in the 1730s, the book was part of the standard curriculum at every Scottish university, also Cambridge in England. Interestingly, not at Oxford, and maybe that's why Oxford lagged behind in scientific endeavor for so long. But all of these people, like Smith and Hume, again, the whole crowd, were educated as Newtonians. They were educated in terms of thinking through in lines of system, mechanism. That's the way they thought. And I accept that, and I talk about it in the book, but I don't make a great to-do about it because this is known. Everybody's always known this. And then there were other influences. Look, Smith lived in what was becoming an increasingly commercial society, and he was a very observant man. He lived in these commercial centers. He lived in London. He lived in Paris. He lived in Glasgow. He spent a couple of years in Paris at the beginning when he was working on the project. And he was very incisive in observing what was going on around him. That too I mentioned, but I felt I didn't have to make a big to-do about it because everybody knows that. What people have omitted, I think, is the religious influence on Smith's and Hume's thinking. And precisely because that's what people are not aware of, that's what I chose to write the book about.
Great, thanks. And Newton himself actually published more or wrote more on theology than he did on science. So there was not the...
Newton was very specific that he intended the book to be used as part of what they at that time called natural theology, the attempt to learn about the divine from observing the creation that the divine had given us. It simply didn't occur to people then to think that the world existed without a divine creator. And so they thought of it as two ways of learning about God. One was revealed theology. You read the Bible, you read what the church fathers had to say. And the other was to look at what they often called the book of nature. But then the question is, how do you understand the book of nature when you read it? Well, Newton was very explicit that he intended the book to be used as part of training young people to, he expressed it as young men, but that's because women in those days weren't educated. I'm confident if Newton were writing today, he would have said young men and young women, to know more intimately the divine by looking at the creation. And indeed, that's how the book was used. When Smith was an undergraduate, the book was used as part of the curriculum in natural theology.
Great. Caden?
Sure. So thank you both for engaging in this discussion, and thank you for having me here. Dr. Friedman, my biggest question for you that I wanted to come in with, just to sort of start this off, as I was reading, I really understood, like, this was very much a progress through history. I would almost call it a timeline. We start with the Protestant Reformation, see John Calvin come into play, and then the leave from Calvinism, and then we turn very much more towards the American scene and Protestantism developing there and how that interacts with capitalism. So I loved the engagement, seeing the idea of, you use the phrase a lot of the time, clerical economists. There's people that are members of the clergy, but also at the same time that are preaching how to spend your wealth, how to use your wealth, how to engage in your social life through the means of wealth. I think that was one of the biggest insights that I got from the book. And an anecdote would be in the founding of the American Economic Association, that 23 of the members of the 150 were clergymen. And they were able to preach on that principle and understand that what they were doing was, in their eyes, of divine nature. So those were some of my biggest takeaways. But I wanted to ask you specifically, what were some of your biggest surprises that you got while you were doing this research? Was it the progress of capitalism directly correlating with the religious thought of the time, or was it something else along the line? So what are your thoughts?
I would say two. And first of all, you're quite right, Caden, in what you say. The American Economic Association in the 1880s was founded quite self-consciously by a bunch of economists who were very closely aligned with what was then called the social gospel movement in American Christianity, led by these great figures like Washington Gladden and Josiah Strong and Walter Rauschenbusch. And Richard T. Ely, the founder, if there was any one person who founded our professional association, it was Ely, who was especially close to Gladden. So the cooperation with the social gospel wing of American Protestantism was right there. But I think this also was well known. I'm not the first person to talk about that. I would say I had two surprises. One, as I was summarizing before, because I knew that neither Smith nor Hume was a religiously committed individual, it just had not occurred to me before to think that religious thinking would nonetheless have shaped their economic thinking. And I had to puzzle quite a lot to understand how that came about. The device that I eventually used was one that I took from Einstein. Einstein had this notion of the world view, or developed in Einstein's original German. And the Einstein idea is that we all have in our minds some kind of image of the world, and that influences our scientific thinking. And Einstein thought it applied not just to scientists, but others as well. And then I realized that my Harvard predecessor, Joseph Schumpeter, had roughly the same idea, although he hadn't fleshed it out the way Einstein did. Schumpeter thought in terms of what he called the pre-analytic vision. Before you sit down to do your economic analysis, any person has in mind what Schumpeter called a pre-analytic vision. And indeed, Schumpeter thought it was sufficiently important that he used a capital V. If you look in Schumpeter's book, the word has a capital. And so the view that I took to try to rationalize this surprise was that even though Smith and Hume were not religious believers, put it that way, they lived in a world in which religion was more central, more pervasive, more important in multidimensional ways, and moreover, a world in which intellectual life was more integrated than what we have today. So for example, at Harvard, we have theologians, we have church historians. They're not in my faculty. They're in something separate called the Harvard Divinity School, which is located, what, a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile away. At Yale, it's even worse. Yale has a very distinguished divinity school also. It's about a mile, little more than a mile from the central part of Yale's campus, and moreover, it's up a steep hill. So if you're riding your bicycle, you really have to want to get up there to go to the Yale Divinity School. Well, that wasn't true in Smith's day. When Smith was a professor at the University in Glasgow, there were only 14 professors. He was the professor of moral philosophy, as I mentioned a minute ago, but there was a professor of divinity, as they called it, in other words, a theologian, and there was a professor of church history right there on his faculty. Or to take another example, Smith and Hume both belong to the most distinguished of these intellectual dining societies. You know, when we read about the Scottish Enlightenment, we read about all these marvelous dining societies that they had for various purposes. Well, the most distinguished one was called the Select Society. There were 31 original members. Smith was one of the 31. Hume was one of the 31, but 5 of them out of the 31 were Church of Scotland ministers. So when Smith and Hume went out to dine with their friends to have these learned discussions, they were dining with Church of Scotland ministers. And just to take one of them as a further example, one of them was this very interesting figure, William Robertson, who was simultaneously the head of the Church of Scotland and also the principal, in our vocabulary, the president of the University of Edinburgh. Well, that would be as if the president of my university was simultaneously the president of Harvard and also the head of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Well, he's not. Or it's as if his predecessor were simultaneously the president of Harvard and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States. Well, she wasn't, but Robertson had that role. So this was one thing that quite surprised me. The whole notion that people who were not religious believers could, because they lived in this world, have a worldview very shaped by religion. Just to be brief in answering your question, I'll cite a second surprise, and that is the way in which religion was used often on both sides of these intense economic debates. So for example, Caden, you mentioned that the founders of the American Economic Association were associated with the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement wasn't the only thing going on in American Christianity at the time. There was a comparable movement competing that we think of today as the gospel of wealth. Well, it turns out the people on the gospel of wealth side, here I'm thinking of clergymen like, for example, Henry Ward Beecher at Plymouth Congregational in Brooklyn, or say Russell Conwell at Grace Baptist in Philadelphia, or Bishop Lawrence, for example, here in Boston. These people had economic views also, and they were different, but they were anchoring their economic views in religion. So either side, these people are influenced by religion, and no matter which side of an economic debate they took, they adduced religious arguments to support what they had to say. I think that took me by surprise also.
I really appreciate that. And I mean, the idea that you're talking about of the worldview is very influential to, I think, every social science, in a sense that we do get a cohesive understanding of what we're trying to understand in our world. We're trying to develop a theory, some model to understand what we're demonstrating. So I just want to quickly roughly paraphrase and cite the general outline of what you try to elaborate in your book. In the general idea that you believe that, and it does demonstrate throughout ample evidence, that we see the rise of capitalism as we leave, after the Protestant Reformation, we leave predestinarian Calvinism. That's the idea that we are decided whether or not we will be saved or redeemed in Christ before we are even known. Millennia, it is already known in God. So by leaving that predestinarian thought in Calvinism, it enables and edifies the concept of self-interest benefiting others. By us working for ourselves, we are going to better the people around us. This coincides with Enlightenment, thinking of, I would use the phrase benevolent second happenings. Things happen out of the ways that they do, and they are beneficial outcomes. And where Smith comes in is that there had been these thoughts before, but Smith comes in and says the agent where this becomes apparent is through market capitalism. It's through markets that we are able to see self-interest benefiting others. So this overthrew the general idea that people don't know their interests. This references Calvinistic ideas of depravity, that man is sinful and that we fell from the very beginning of Adam and Eve, that we are not moral in our self-interest for that same reason. And if we were to aspire our own self-interests, that we would just devolve into a Hobbesian almost war, just constantly in conflict. So it reinvigorated the general idea that we could pursue our own self-interests and know our own human nature, and that we could determine our destiny and our purpose. And generally through this worldview of redefining and leaving Calvinism and predestinarian thought, you take that as the exigency for market capitalism. And then that then goes into the discussion of what human destiny is, the social gospel, the gospel of wealth. And what I think is really interesting is the division between pre and post-millennial thought. That's the general idea that is God coming very soon, or is he going to come after a millennium of peace that's roughly 1,000 years, as outlined in Revelations. So you really elaborate, and as you said, referencing the different sides of the aisle of economic thinking, pre and post-millennialism as the edification for those two different economic thoughts. I just wanted to ask you, do you think that the religious interpretation of pre and post-millennialism do you think it was used as a tool for different economic thinkers or for clergymen as well? Or do you think that it was actually used as a religious exigency? Did you find anything within your research that would coincide to either of those ideas?
I don't think I'm capable of answering you're asking a very interesting question, and I'm not capable of answering it because, to repeat, I'm an economist, and you're really asking a question about the origin and intent underlying these religious views. And for that, I think you want some kind of a religious historian to answer. I'm an economist, and so I took the religious views as a given. And the analysis I was pursuing was to understand how those religious views, given that they were there, and to a certain extent still are, how those influenced and continue to influence economic thinking. But now you're pushing the question back even further. You're saying, yes, 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 but let's not just take as given that the religious views were there. Let's try to understand where they came from. Now, that's a very interesting question as well, and that I think requires a religious historian to address. But I'm glad you brought up this view of post versus pre-millennialism. Today, there isn't much in the way of, at least in the United States, there's not much in the way of explicit post-millennialism around. For listeners who are not familiar with these terms, the idea of pre-millennialism is that the second coming will occur and the world as we know it will end before the 1,000 years of bliss as foretold in Revelation 20 and 21. And the import of that has typically been that premillennialist thinkers do not really believe much in human progress. They don't think that the world will improve or indeed needs to improve before the second coming occurs. And for that reason, premillennialists have typically not been supportive historically of reform movements that they do not interpret in fairly straightforward moral terms. So to be explicit, in the United States, premillennialists were very active in the abolition movement to abolish slavery. They were very active in the temperance movement, which gave us prohibition. They interpreted these things as being explicitly about man's moral state. But premillennialists have typically opposed secular reform of movements. The idea, should the government try to eradicate poverty? Their view is not needed. What's needed is the salvation of souls, not the creation of a better world, because the creation of a better world will take place when the second coming arises. And this turns out to be very important in American politics today, because almost all evangelical Protestant groups are premillennial in their theology. That too is an interesting story. As I point out, that really wasn't true until about a century ago. It was as a consequence of the publication of the fundamentals in the early 19 and teens. But it is true today. And so you have a very distinct gulf between the way in which premillennialists and other Americans tend to approach questions of social reform that we do not attach explicit moral overtones to.
Great. I'd like to go back to the question, the first part of Caden's question, which had to do with Adam Smith. So prior to Smith, the belief was that a person could not know their own self-interest. So there's this kind of epistemic limit. Then it was also believed that if you could know what's in your self-interest, it would not be moral to pursue it. So there's kind of an ethical limit to enacting a program of following your self-interest. And then there was this belief that individuals pursuing self-interest leads us to Hobbes's state of war. So there's a political or social limit to pursuing self-interest. And those three limitations are overcome by Smith in The Wealth of Nations. Do you want to spend a moment maybe talking about Smith's contribution on those
Well,
topics?
I will. Let me start, Mike, by saying that you got exactly right the three propositions that summarized, I think, the state of play of thinking about economic matters before Smith. I would put them in a slightly different order than you did, though. First, to begin with, you're right, there was no presumption that people, ordinary individuals, would understand what was in their self-interest to do in the economic sphere. And for that reason, it was treated as important to run an economy from the top down, not the bottom up. So the English had all of their government granted monopolies, the French had their mercantilist system, and so forth. But second, and here what I get to the real heart of the matter, before Smith, there was no understanding that even if people did know what was in their own self-interest to do and acted on it, that would make anybody other than themselves better off. So they had no understanding of what we economists today call the first fundamental welfare theorem, which is the proposition that when individuals act on their own self-interest in the right setting, and of course, thanks to Smith, we know that the right setting is competitive markets, then they will make other people, in addition to themselves, better off. So there was no understanding of the first fundamental welfare theorem. And then third, I would say, because of that, there was this long tradition that acting on your own self-interest in the economic sphere was morally opprobrious. You know, go back, Augustine, for example, thought that the lust for money was comparable to the lust for sexual activity and also the lust for power over other men. That was the three great lusts in Augustine. Now, come forward to Smith. Smith, first of all, goes through this whole analysis of how people do have the understanding of what's in their own self-interest to do when they act as producers of goods and services. That's a very subtle point, because Smith did not think that people necessarily get it right when they act as consumers. In fact, The Wealth of Nations is full of all sorts of contemptuous, scathing comments on people's stupid, frivolous behavior as consumers. But Smith was a very careful thinker, and in the spirit of a mathematician who doesn't want to assume anything stronger than what he needs to prove his theorem, Smith understood that all he really needed was that people get it right when they act as producers of goods and services. Second, then the great breakthrough was that Smith understood that because of the force of competition working its way through a market setting, when individuals act on their own economic self-interest in the right circumstances, again, market competition, that does make other people, in addition to themselves, better off. So Smith had the first fundamental welfare theorem. And then finally, because he had the welfare theorem, then by the time you get to Smith, the whole vocabulary of vice and vicious attached, that was the standard way of talking before Smith about this morally opprobrious behavior of acting on your self-interest in the economic sphere. By the time you get to the Wealth of Nations, that whole vocabulary is gone. Those words, vice and vicious, do occur in the book many times, but never ever to refer to merely acting on your own self-interest in the economic sphere. So I think this is, in effect, the great contribution of Smith. And I think it was, to return to the main theme that Caden was outlining before, I think it's powerfully enabled by this new view of humans and their possibilities that are was enabled by the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. Instead of Calvinist depravity, you have a much more optimistic, benign view of the human character. And instead of the very restrictive view of human choice and human agency, because of the view that the most important thing that matters to you is already decided before you're born, indeed before the world was created, namely whether you're saved or not, under the position to which people moved in the Protestant world after Calvin. The idea was that, yes, the actions that you take and the choices you make are causal and are determinative with respect to your salvation. The way John Tillotson put it, Tillotson was the first Archbishop of Canterbury appointed after the Glorious Revolution in England. He said, individuals have the ability to cooperate with God in achieving their salvation. Well, this, I think, opened up a whole more expansive view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. And I think that's part of what enabled Smith to come to these insights about how self-interest driven human behavior could have positive effects.
Great. That's a very fascinating discussion. I think I look at this book as kind of a counter argument to two interpretations that have had some currency. The first of which is the one you mentioned, the standard reading, that market economics arises as part of a secular Enlightenment project. So I think that you've demonstrated that that's not a complete picture, and that the religious influences are there even on people who are not themselves personally religious, like Hume and Smith. The second interrogator I hear in reading the book is Max Weber, and Weber argued that it was the uncertainty of not knowing, if you were one of the elect, that made it acceptable to have a kind of commercial prosperity as a proxy. So the argument is that God would not prosper the work of my hands if I were not an elect, if I were not one of the saved. You've said that you're turning Weber upside down. Can you talk about what your differences from Max Weber's reading of history is?
Yes, I think there are two central differences in between my book and Weber's. To begin, say again, I'm an economist. I'm interested here in the thinking of economists, or people whom we would recognize today as economists. Weber was not an economist. Weber was a sociologist. So he was interested in the behavior and attitudes of ordinary citizens. So I'm interested in people like Adam Smith, and then many of these great figures down through the 19th and the 20th century and on to our present day. So I'm looking at the intellectual elite who are thinking, and Weber is looking at the action of ordinary individuals. He's asking what drove people to work hard at their businesses, what drove people to save, what drove people to invest in a new endeavor. I'm asking what led people like Adam Smith, and moving now to the United States, Francis Wayland and Richard T. Ely and John Bates Clark, what led all of these people to do the economic thinking that they did. So in effect, I'm doing intellectual history of economics. Weber's doing historical sociology. The second point, which is a matter of difference, is that we're looking at different centuries. Weber is looking at the period in which not capitalist economic thinking, but actual capitalism on the ground started. And therefore, he's looking primarily at the late 16th, but then on into the 17th century, when capitalism was, when Calvinism was at its height. Weber's discussion of the United States, and features all of these Puritans walking around in what he described as a state of existential anxiety over whether they were among the elect, exactly as you described. I'm looking at the origins of modern Western economics, not in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, but in the 18th century. And this is the period in which Calvinism wasn't the prevailing view. People are moving away from Calvinism. So again, Weber was looking primarily at the 17th century, and I'm looking more at the 18th century. The movement away from predestinarian Calvinism was a kind of rolling phenomenon in the English-speaking world. In England, that movement was probably at its height in the latter half of the 17th century. It reached its height in Scotland in the first half of the 18th century. Importantly, right when Adam Smith and David Hume were coming into young adulthood and forming their worldview, their Schumpeterian vision of the world. And although it's a different story, that movement away from predestinarian Calvinism was at its height in America in the latter half of the 18th century, not coincidentally right when the founding fathers were creating the American Republic. And that's an interesting story too, but it's a different one.
Great. So I wanted to mention that we're going to be saving time for questions from the attendees. So anyone who has some questions can start to put them in the Q&A window. I know this book is about the origins of capitalism, but I'd like to pivot, if I may, to the future of capitalism. I think Caden has a question on that, and then I have another question on that, if we may.
Sure. So one of my biggest questions, and we've engaged with this again, the idea of the worldview. The time when economics was coming out and flourishing was in the time of Adam Smith, and then throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, religion was a very, very central part of people's lives. It was a very central idea of how people thought. And it was a part of intellectual arguments. It was something that, like you said, at the University at Edinburgh and Glasgow, it was all the same faculty. In modern days, people put forth the argument that we are entering into what we would call a secular age. Whether it be the idea that, now I grant that America has a high percentage of religiosity and a lot of people consider themselves to be religious, but there is a crucial argument that comes out in theological circles and also social circles that we don't discuss and we don't edify spirituality within ourselves through a religious aspect. I'm thinking specifically of a book titled This A Secular Age. And as we go throughout this and as we go forward, do you believe that the future of capitalism, Western capitalism as we know it, do we believe that we will see in this eye a further divergence between religion and capitalism, or a convergence of secularism and economics in our modern thought? Or do you think that we'll see a reconvergence, or do you think it'll just continue to ebb and flow? As you demonstrate throughout your book, it does ebb and flow between many different viewpoints throughout Europe and even going into America. What do you think is the future of capitalism engaging with religion, if there will be any engagement?
To begin, you're absolutely right. We do not live, and I think I was emphasizing this before, we do not live in a world in which religion is as important or as pervasive or as central as it was in 17th century Scotland. Our intellectual life is very segmented in a way that it wasn't before. I mentioned at my university, the theologians, we have them, but we keep them carefully separated off. They're over at the divinity school. That very few of our undergraduates take courses at the Harvard Divinity School, and I'm guessing that must be the case at many other American universities as well. So religion just can't today have the kind of pervasive influence on people's worldview that it did in those days. Now, I think this is reinforced for purposes of your question, Caden, by another, I don't know whether to call it force, another feature of intellectual life that I discuss in the book. Here, something that I take from Kuhn, the intellectual historian, and it's the idea that intellectual disciplines in their early phases are very subject to influence from outside, even in their core theoretical approaches. And I think that's what happened to economics. Smith and Hume were giving us the very creation, the infancy of economics as an intellectual discipline. But as we've come through the nearly a quarter of a century since then, you know, we're 5 years away from the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. As we've come through the centuries since then, economics as a discipline has matured, for which we should be pleased. And as it's matured, it has therefore become increasingly insulated from outside influences at the theoretical core of the subject. Now, that may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing, but I think that's part of the maturation process. So I see the theoretical core of economics now having a life and momentum of its own that simply is not going to be influenced by religious thinking, or for that matter, by anything else. It's got its own driving force the same way physics does, the same way any of these other mature disciplines. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that religion has no role to play in economic thinking, because after all, the great body politic doesn't give a hoot about the central core of economic thinking. They care about the economic features of the world in which they live. And therefore, as I was saying at the outset, I think where we see the influence of religious thinking today is not in the theoretical work that economists do, but rather in the way ordinary citizens view the economy, the role of government in the economy, the role of capitalism versus something else, although since there isn't anything obvious to have as the something else, that necessarily is a very amorphous discussion. And as I point out in the book, there's evidence not only that American citizens differ from one another about these great economic issues of the day, but that the differences that Americans exhibit among themselves are very highly correlated with their religious affiliations. Well, that shows that religious thinking is still has a role to play. I would argue the causation goes that way. It isn't that people have one set of it isn't that people have one set of economic views and therefore decide which church to belong to. They belong to whatever church they belong to, and then that turns out to influence their economic views. And whether we look at voting behavior, whether we look at answers to opinion survey questions on issues like taxation, issues like government regulation, issues like the welfare state, again and again and again, the evidence is very clear that there is a difference, and the difference is most easily visible in the distinctions between the way in which evangelical Protestants think about these issues and others. And evangelical Protestants have a variety of aspects of their theology that might matter for this purpose, but the one that I think is most important is the one, Caden, you mentioned before, namely the fact that they are almost universally premillennialist in their theology, and therefore predisposed against thinking that the role of either private or government activity is to reform the world. It's rather, except in moral terms, it's rather to save souls.
So I would like to ask a question on the future of capitalism, now that we've seen a number of economists write that the objective of economic growth is no longer sustainable. So, Tim Jackson in the UK has published on zero growth economic policy. Kate Raworth has published on donut economics. So in relationship to your prior work on the moral consequences of economic growth, how do you respond to the argument that especially the developed nations, the advanced economies, need to de-emphasize growth in order to minimize, the mother of all externalities, which is climate change?
Well, I certainly think we have a different view of climate change and the environment in general than we did 25 or especially 50 years ago. But you're quite right, Mike, to point to my previous book. That's what the book was about. The title was The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. And the argument there was that it is not true that all of the moral externalities associated with growth are on the negative side. We talk in terms of negative moral externalities, especially in environment, and also things that might be environment or not, things like species extinction and so forth. And yes, it's true, of course. We understand that there are some negative moral externalities, but the burden of that book was to say that there are important positive externalities as well, and we need to balance those. And the particular set of positive externalities to which I point are aspects of the society that tend to flourish when societies are experiencing rising living standards. What I did at some length in the book was to document that when societies are experiencing sustained long-term improvements in living standards, that is the circumstance under which societies experience improvements also in the non-material aspects of their lives, to which we attach a positive moral overtone. Things like providing opportunities to people, things like tolerance with respect to what? And as an American, I would think of receptivity to openness to immigrants. As an American, I would think about race relations, but there are also issues like religious and ethnic prejudice, things like generosity to the poor, toward the poor. It's all very well to speak of opportunities, but we all know that there's some people who are not going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities provided. I think about the dedication to democracy and the strength of democratic institutions. And what I think I showed in that book is that again and again and again throughout the history of the modern Western democracies, when these societies are experiencing sustained improvement in their material living standards, that's the circumstance under which they're also likely to make progress in these other non-material but moral aspects of their society. And conversely, when societies stagnate, or worse, when people lose a sense of getting ahead in their material living standards, then not only do they typically not make progress in these moral dimensions, often there are periods of retrenchment, retreat, and sometimes quite disastrously so. So on that ground, I would resist calls for what you call zero economic growth. I think there are, of course, environmental externalities. Those are on one side, but I think there are important moral externalities on the other as well.
Okay, great answer. We now have a question from the audience. Caden?
Sure. So Dr. Friedman, going back to talking about Adam Smith and the context of the book, we have a question from the Q&A here that says, did Christian thought on natural law influence the way that Smith and other early economists thought about the proper or best relationship between the individual and the state?
I don't think so. You might have to be a better Smith scholar than I. I think of natural law theory as primarily having flourished in the Roman Catholic world of an earlier period. And Smith and Hume did not grow up in a world with lots of Roman Catholics in Edinburgh. Now, to be sure, Smith lived in France for a while, and he met plenty of Catholics there. Most was primarily influenced by Kane, and Hume lived in Paris for a while also. But this was a later life thing for them, and I don't think that theological ideas that were more tied to Roman Catholicism played a major role in establishing their worldview. One of the interesting questions that I sometimes get about the book is precisely, people say, well, here the book is emphasizing Protestant thought. How about, didn't Aquinas have a lot to say about economics as well? Isn't there a lot of Roman Catholic thinking that has important economic implications? How about all the work of Father Lonergan and all that sort of thing? Or how about talking about the economic implications of the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud? And I go back to the fact that I wrote the book from the other direction. It wasn't that I was starting with religious thinking and wanting to explore the economic implications of religious thinking. If I had, then why limit it to Protestant thinking? I started from the other end. I started by looking to explain the economic thinking of people like Smith and Hume and their successors. And for that purpose, I don't think Roman Catholic concepts were particularly relevant, nor for that matter, the Hebrew Bible. I don't think, I actually looked did some research on it, and I couldn't find any evidence that Smith had ever met a Jew, for example. Well, okay, but that means that there's certain lines of thought that are not going to turn out to be very important in forming Smith's worldview.
I'd like to ask, if I may, a question about the teaching of economics today. Joe Stiglitz has an article questioning the two fundamental theorems of welfare economics. And in that article, he argues that there's a serious lack of historical awareness in the teaching of economics. Or an economist like the Stanford economist Paul David promoted a historicism, or tried to advocate for a historicism in economics. Do you think that there's this historical knowledge deficit, or that economics is too mathematical today? Or what's your view on how economics is taught?
Well, let's separate the historical question from the issue of the use of mathematics. Yes, I certainly do think so. And I think by what economists call revealed preference. Look, I've spent devoted a whole book looking at the historical origins of the economic thinking that we have as modern Western economics. And much of my previous book was historical in a different way. It used social and political history to document these positive externalities of economic growth that I was talking about a while ago. So yes, absolutely. Please associate me with Joe Stiglitz. Please associate me with Paul David in this line of view. And if some economists read my book and come away with a more fully formed historical sense of where our discipline came from and its intellectual roots, well, maybe I've made a small contribution to rectifying the problem that you quote Joe as pointing to. As I mentioned, I think in response to Caden a few minutes ago, economics grew out of a close association with political theory, political science, history. Again, the 19th century word for the subject was political economy. And this divergence of paths in these different intellectual disciplines is now nearly a century and a half old. It goes back to the latter part of the 19th century. In this respect, the Americans were following the Germans. And one can argue whether that's too bad, whether we would have been better off if there had been political economy departments instead of economics departments, but it doesn't do us any good to relitigate that now. The question is the one that you identify with Joe and Paul. Would economists do better to have a more fully informed historical sense, both a historical sense of the intellectual development of our subject and a more historical sense of what the issues have been and how actual economies have behaved? And I think the answer is yes. I'm very proud of the fact that in my department, we have several very distinguished economic historians. I think that's great. I wish we had more, but I'm glad we have the ones we do.
Great, thank you. I think there's a question in the chat, Caden, and then I think Caden has an additional question.
Sure. So our question from the chat here, for you, Professor Friedman, on a similar note about other strands of religious thought and economics, is what you did not see as important to what you did see to your story? So we're talking about omission versus inclusion of information and facts. More specifically, did you not see much evidence for traditional moral concerns about usury among the subjects you studied? And do you think that critical to your historical interpretation about the influence of a certain kind of Anglo-Protestant Christianity and the development of market economic thought in the areas you've studied?
Well, on usury, the people of this era didn't get terribly exercised about usury, I don't think. There's a long history of development of this line of thought from the Roman Catholic period through Luther on to Calvin. By the time we got to Calvin, people were having a very different view of usury than they did in agrarian societies. If you go back to the origin of these prohibitions on usury, it comes up in the Hebrew Bible 3 times. It's in Leviticus, it's in Exodus, and it's in Deuteronomy. And you can understand in an agrarian society why charging people interest would have been a very morally questionable thing to do. If somebody's borrowing, it's probably because his harvest fails and he's trying to feed his family. People didn't have much use for debt. They weren't doing a lot of capital investment. Wealth was overwhelmingly land. So you can see that there would have been a view of interest payments in those days that was very different. By the time you get to Calvin, here we are Calvin's living in 16th century Geneva. You have a kind of proto-commercial society growing up. So if somebody's borrowing in 16th century Geneva, he's probably not worried about his harvest. He's probably trying to open up a watch factory. And if part of what enables him to open up the watch factory is that you let him have your life savings, well, why shouldn't you share in his profit? Well, again, the whole thing is very different. Now, by the time we get to the 18th century in Scotland or in England, people are not very exercised about this. Smith did write about wanting to have prohibitions on banks lending at high interest rates, but it wasn't any kind of a religiously based concern. Smith's view was simply that if the interest rate was too high, then the only people who were likely to borrow at that interest rate were people whose projects were so speculative, so risky. He doesn't say so flaky, but if you read the text, that's what he's talking about. That the bank shouldn't be lending to those people. So when Smith is focused on prohibiting, he was in favor of prohibiting interest rates above 5%, but that's about banks lending on too much risk. So there are things that are not there. But there are other things that are there. In the book, for example, I discuss a very interesting essay that that Hume wrote, I think in the 1740s, on avarice. And when you look at some of the things that Hume wrote about avarice, it looks like Augustine. Now, was Hume self-consciously quoting from Augustine? Surely not. But he seemed to have known about that.
Great. So we're just about to wrap up. I'm going to let Caden have the final question.
Sure. So
and before, if I may interrupt, before we move to the last question with Caden, Mike, let me congratulate you on your good sense in having a student participate in the conversation. This is exactly what we like to do as well. And so, Caden, thank you for being here and thank you for participating. And in some sense, I'm treating you as emblematic of a student presence, which is all to the good.
Great.
I appreciate that, Dr. Friedman. It's an honor to be here with you. And I really am appreciative of Dr. Kane for being able to invite me to participate in this discussion. We actively engaged over the book, and we both have our own moral and religious alignments that we bring into it while discussing it. In bringing that into discussion, I wanted to ask you, we discussed throughout the book, throughout the American scene in Western economics, very much the idea of Protestantism taking the reins, leading the idea of economic thinking all the way up to modern contemporary economic thought. So one of the leading, I would argue, one of the leading Protestant theologians and pastors and apologists of our time is Tim Keller. He's from New York, based out of New York, has his own church, and he often preaches on the idea of works, that for Protestants, we have free will. So we are able to elect whether or not we choose Christ as our Redeemer and our Savior. That is our choice and our agency. So anti-predestinarian thought. And he said, it is because of that grace and our faith in that grace that we are called to good works. And it isn't necessarily a calling that I owe it to God. It's fitting. It is what is proper. So would you argue that from this sentiment, something that I often hear, and that I would argue that a lot of people that I know that associate with Protestant Christian thought believe, would you say that this elaboration of works in faith and in economics aligns more so with the idea of the social gospel, or more so the gospel of wealth? And if it conflicts, or if somewhere in between the two, what would you argue?
Well, to begin, I would be, if we're talking today, I would be more comfortable thinking of it in less explicitly religious terms and more, I don't want to call it secular terms. You referred to Charles Taylor's book before, and I know what Charles means, and that's not what I want to mean. I want to, a word that I sometimes introduce to indicate what I mean is post-doctrinalism. The notion that people have this sense that some kind of religious impulse, whether explicitly religious or not, is valuable, but they're not very exercised about the specific religious creed or theology that goes with it. At my university, for example, I think we have 35 chaplaincies. Sounds like a lot, and it is. But my sense is that these 35 chaplains all have the sense that they're doing the same thing, that they're all working together. No, at one level there isn't. Of course, the Presbyterian chaplain would prefer that somebody be coming to the Presbyterian church than going to the whatever church. But nonetheless, I think these people have the sense of all being in the same line of work, all working toward the same project in a way that wouldn't have been different 100 or so years ago. Or to give you a more dramatic example, about 20 years ago, the Mormon church here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, burned down. And immediately, all of the different prayer meeting groups from the Mormon church were taken in by the local church, neighborhood churches. So the 10 in the morning prayer group was taken in by the Episcopalians. The 2 in the afternoon group was taken in by the Congregationalists, and so forth and so on. 100 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. 100 years ago, if the Mormon church had burned down, the Episcopalians would have looked at the Congregationalists and said, well, see. So it's a different world. So I would much prefer to put it in terms of something that, and I'm trying to be careful here not to follow Charles in thinking that it's a secular age. The sociologist Robert Bellah had this marvelous phrase, civic religion, or maybe he called it civil religion. I think civil religion. And I think there's something to that. And there's an important religious, civil religious, moral core that I think is important for the society. That was Bellah's argument back in the 60s. And I think it's true today. And look, you don't need to be a Methodist to warm up to Wesley's idea that you should earn all you can and save all you can and give all you can. If you simply enunciated those three ideas in a group, modern Americans, you would get a lot of agreement among all sorts of people who would have no idea you're quoting John Wesley. So I think these ideas, and here is where, and Mike was asking before about Weber, here is where my ideas are very congruent with Weber. There is something about these religious ideas that get absorbed into the society and expressed in a way that then is almost freestanding from its religious roots. I mean, remember, Weber was a sociologist and therefore worked with what the sociologists call ideal types. And he was very careful that he wanted an ideal type who was an American of the middle of the 18th century, by which these religious ideas had gone away. And so he picked Benjamin Franklin. Because Franklin was, at best some kind of a deist. If he'd wanted a religious figure, he would have picked Jonathan Edwards, but he didn't. He picked Franklin. Well, I think that's my view of the way in which the process that you're asking about fits in America today. Yes, it's there. Yes, it's important. For purposes of the future, both of the economy and of the society, I think it's very important that it be preserved, but it isn't important that it be preserved in the context of a specific religious creedal statement. And I'm guessing not only is it not important that it be preserved that way, it isn't going to be. So that's where I come out on what you're asking.
Great, great, thank you. So as we close, I just want to thank the people who have taken part of their day today to listen into this conversation. Thanks again to our co-sponsors. Thank you, Caden, excellent job. And most especially, thank you, Dr. Friedman, for coming to discuss your important new book. It's been a great honor to have you. We appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, Mike. I'm honored to be here and enjoyed talking to you and talking to Caden as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Take care all.